Now, during the State of the Nation address debate in Parliament, Communications and Digital Technologies Minister Khumbudzo Ntshavheni announced that the government plans to give 10 gigabytes of free data to every household. Minister Ntshavheni further added that the data has become a new utility that all households should have, like water and electricity. To talk more about this, we're joined by MyBroadband Editor, Vermeulen. Jan, thanks so much for speaking to us. Two parts to this conversation, I suppose, that we can look at. But the first part is, let's take a look at the impact of 10 gigabytes of data on every household. If that became available, what would it do to the landscape?
Yeah, it would certainly dramatically level access to broadband in South Africa, because it's one thing to have coverage, which you've got a lot of. The mobile network operators have let us know, that they've got, well over 90%, 98, 99% population coverage in South Africa. Only really remote areas don't have coverage. But that still doesn't mean that there's actually data in the hands of people. And so, it would dramatically level the playing field in terms of access to the internet and to those digital services. The last step, the last hurdle after the data becomes available is having devices available to everybody in the country so that they can access the internet, of course.
Now, when you talk about leveling the playing field, what obviously comes to mind is all those kids that are going to school, the university students that have particularly struggled, especially during this time of COVID.
Exactly. So education is one major area. We had the private schools earlier in the year when the matric results were being announced, the IEB saying, they didn't really struggle at all with maintaining their matric pass rate because their teachers and learners had easy access to broadband, and that really helped them. And, said this is something that, the government should really look at for public schools. Education is one area. Another one is searching for jobs. If you can make it easier for people to search for jobs so that they don't have to pay for the transport to go in hunt for jobs, save that money and spend it on, other essentials. That's another major leveler. So it's really the impact of having everybody have access to 10 gigs of data is tremendous. It's still a limited amount of data, but for the average South African that is subsisting on a couple of megabytes a day, it would be life-changing.
Interestingly, when I was prepping for this interview, I looked at an online poll where 80% of the respondents said that they would use 10 gigabytes of data if it became available to bettering themselves.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear. I think that there would be a huge amount of YouTube still getting watched with that data, but that's also okay. So, there's a tremendous amount of free resources available with the mobile operators making a bunch of educational content free to access, free to stream. But there's a tremendous amount of educational content available on platforms like YouTube too. So it's encouraging to hear that people would use it to bettering themselves. And even if it is to, play Wordle every morning, that's okay too.
Now, the other side of the coin is all about lip service and the countless promises that government has made to its citizens. So let's talk about the practicality of getting 10 gigabytes of data to every household in South Africa.
Sure thing. So firstly, the minister disclosed no plan or exact timeline. We can kind of piece together different announcements that government's made over the years. For example, in recent parliamentary questions, the Department of Communications said that, and the minister said that she's got a request before Treasury for money for a broadband fund. And so, you can put one and one together and kind of get the idea that that could be the beginnings of this 10 gigabyte grant, making, some kind of internet grant available for the poorest households in the country to start with, for a starting point. But yeah, at the end of the day, someone has to pay for it. And the way I see it, there's two ways to handle it. It's either going to come directly, out of the fiscus as part of the tax. money that we contribute into the fiscus every year, and basically government then pays the mobile operators for 10 gigs a day, 10 gigs a month for every household, and at some kind of preferential rate. And then the other way to potentially do it is to push the responsibility of providing this free allocation of data onto the operators themselves, which would then come out of the pockets of their subscribers. They'll have to make up the shortfall somehow. So those are the two most practical solutions to this that I see. The minister, as I said, hasn't disclosed any plans, and certainly I would think that just using Telkom, for example, which is partially state-owned, to say, okay, all this data gets rolled out on Telkom's network would cause the other operators, not just Vodacom and MTN, but smaller operators like Cell C and Rain, to bulk and say, no, but that's anti-competitive. You can't just do it on one network. You have to open it up. So those two ways are really the two most practical solutions that I see. But that would require quite a lot of law writing and quite a lot of negotiation to get off the ground.
Well, before we talk about the ICASA spectrum and the impact that it will have, because it is suggested that once that comes into effect, whenever it is, it will bring down significantly the cost of data. What would the current cost of data be at the moment if every household was to receive 10 gigabytes? I mean, don't expect you to give me an exact number to the cent, but kind of give us an idea of what it would cost.
Yeah, so honestly, you get such a diverse spectrum of pricing in the market now. I think you could quite easily get 10 gigs of data for 200 Rand a month, probably less, depending on the special that you land, and whether you're on contract or prepaid. It's that's now the interesting thing about 10 gigs versus 1 gig, right? So like 1 gig of data will cost you, say, 50 to 80 Rand or 50 to 90 Rand for 1 gig of data. But as your purchasing power increases, the cost per gig actually comes down quite dramatically. And if you sign yourself into a long-term contract, even more so, because it lets the networks what they call capacitate their network, right? So they're able to go, I can predictably say that I'm going to need this amount of capacity on that tower, in that general vicinity, because I know I've got a contract customer there. And so if the government effectively goes into an infinitely long contract with the mobile network operators, that should bring down the costs for them to purchase this amount of data as well. I hope I've answered that part of the question.
Now, if the spectrum does come into being, what impact would that have? Would it make it more practical?
No. It would make it cheaper. But the practicality of it is still, how do you measure, or how do you make sure this only goes to households? How do you curb fraud? How do you make it free? How do you make it fair to all mobile network operators? Is there going to be some kind of voucher system? Are you going to make it the mobile network operators' problem to identify that that they don't double up on certain households? So the allocation of the spectrum would make it cheaper, but there's a lot of logistical hurdles to making something like this work if you want to make sure that people don't defraud the system.
So it brings us back to that question or the suggestion of lip service by government. And if we look at the absence of a clear timeline, the absence of specific plan on how this would work, it almost suggests that it's all talk and very little action in the immediate to short-term future.
We are in an election year, so one should keep that in mind, at least in terms of the ANC elections coming up. And so, there's going to be a lot of promises being made this year that one has to take with a pinch of salt. That said, this is I'm a cynical guy. I characterize myself as a cynical optimist when it comes to broadband stuff. I've been in this space for a while, but even though the specific of 10 gigs for every household, that thing in itself might not come to fruition. The level of action that we've seen from the president and from this minister and her predecessor when it comes to these matters, when it comes to spectrum, when it comes to the digital migration, for the first time in 10 years, we're seeing some actual movement in the space. It's really encouraging. And so, yes, there's a lot of talk. There's probably a lot of bluster. They've probably underestimated the complexity of what they're trying to achieve. But I'd rather have politicians that try and fail than that don't try at all.
Very, very quickly, final thoughts. It has been described, well, certainly the provision of data or availability of internet has been described as a basic human right in some quarters. Are you in agreement?
Yes, but I am the editor for a website called MyBroadband. So I might not be the most unbiased opinion, but I mean, by other objective measures, if you look at World Bank studies that show that an increase in broadband penetration increases GDP output of a country, that doesn't speak to human rights necessarily, but it certainly speaks to the benefits that you get as a country if you do recognize it as a human right. If you purely go on the benefits to us as a society, it's worthwhile. And certainly it's increasingly becoming necessary to be participating in just the country as a whole. Being able to apply for jobs, being able to access information, it's becoming essential. And so if it's certainly, I would think of it in that respect, if you consider all these factors, it's a human right.
MyBroadband editor Jan Vermeulen, cynical optimist, he calls himself. We appreciate you making the time this evening.